Hi, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, joined by Sheldon Richman, and this is the Libertarian Angle, our show here at the Future of Freedom Foundation, in which we provide you with the libertarian perspective on what's going on in the world, the perspective that you're certainly not going to get in the mainstream media. Sheldon, I thought we'd talk a little bit about the drug war. I know we've addressed that before, but I don't think you can ever address the drug war too many times, given that it still plays such a prominent role in the violation of fundamental rights and the liberty of the American people and all of its destructive aspects. And I think we're getting close, at least closer to the real solution, and that's drug legalization, to this act of government prohibition. And what stirred my interest in this again was that this very interesting report, a scholarly report that's just been issued by the London School of Economics. And anybody who would like to take a look at that, just Google, drug war, London School of Economics, and it'll come up. And included in that report are the endorsements of 5 Nobel Prize winners. And the thrust of the report is that the drug war has been a total failure. It has not accomplished its purported end, which is to have a drug-free society, or a society in which drug use is very minimal. We all can agree with that, even the drug warriors, because if it had been achieved, the drug warriors would say, okay, time to dismantle the drug war. So that's been a failure. But they also talk about in this report is the horrible collateral damage from this war, all the violence and the gang wars and the assassinations, and they especially focus on Latin America and other parts of the third world where you've had this horrible consequence of the drug war, especially like in Mexico, where you've got, 40, 50, 60,000 dead people, not from drugs, but from the drug war and the vicious crackdown in the drug war. So here we are, Sheldon. Decades after they declared war on drugs, but I think we're still living with this monstrosity. But the good news is that we're a long way from where we were, a few decades ago, where libertarians were sort of out there by themselves calling for drug legalization. Now you've got all these prominent people doing it, including 5 Nobel Prize winners.
Yeah, I saw Vernon Smith was among, I think, the only free market guy of the 5 that I could tell. I looked through that study and read the abstracts of the various chapters on different aspects of this whole thing. Yes, it's a good sign that the futility of an outright war on drugs is being more and more recognized. The view is pretty widespread now that there's no way drugs are going to disappear from society as a result of police action and military and all that stuff. And you're right, they do talk quite a bit about the very bad effects in the countries where, what they call the supply countries, where there's eradication of crops, and that has just led to, intensification of authoritarianism and dictatorship in those countries and repression of all various kinds. But to throw a bit of a wet blanket on it, it was very disappointing to see that, none of them, of course, hit on the libertarian idea that there just ought to be, the government ought to just get out of this altogether. They call for instead what's, the new byword is, public health and harm reduction remedies. And that means the government will still be in the thick of things. They want to, send people to rehab instead of to jail. But what's left a little unclear, the way they do it today is a judge will tell somebody, you go to rehab or you will go to jail. Some people don't want to go to rehab. They may believe they don't need rehab. To echo Thomas Szasz here, they may feel they don't have a problem. It's the state telling them they have a problem. So, this is the sort of thing that's called for. They also call for market management or black market management. One of the papers calls for driving the black market further underground, I guess, so that people come in contact with it less prominently than they do today. One of the papers says that the usual studies underestimate the effect of prohibition on pushing up the price and reducing access to drugs. So that seems to be in favor of government efforts to raise the price of drugs so people will buy less or won't buy it at all. So it's really a mixed bag. It's true they don't want the status quo, but they have not stumbled onto the libertarian idea, I'm sad to say.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what it is that guides this kind of mindset, that feels the need for government to control people's peaceful choices in life. Here you've got these brilliant people, these 5 Nobel laureates. Vernon Smith may be an exception to this as far as the solution. But here they see that prohibition has failed. It's just absolutely failed. And yet they cannot bring themselves to think in terms of libertarian principles, that what role does the state have in dictating to people what they should be ingesting and not ingesting? And if you go back to prohibition of alcohol, to me, the analogy works perfectly. That here you had all this collateral damage, violence, Al Capone, gang wars, and police corruption, and a totally failed experiment. People kept drinking. And the solution was, okay, just legalize it. Get rid of it. Now, it's not a perfect system with booze. We know that they have licensed sellers and so forth. But by and large, you don't have this sense of prohibition. You don't have judges, prosecutors prosecuting people for being alcoholics or drinking booze and sending them into Alcoholics Anonymous. And so, I think the glass here is half full and half empty. It's half full in the sense that these people are recognizing that this is another failed experiment, and it's half empty in the sense that they're not recognizing that the solution is not to have the state mandatorily send somebody into rehab. It's to leave people alone. Leave people free to live their lives the way they want as long as their conduct is peaceful. If they make the wrong choices, drug addiction or whatever, let them ferret it out with the assistance of perhaps family or friends or rehab centers and so forth. But ultimately, Sheldon, it seems to me this is a personal decision and a personal problem, if it is a problem, that people have to manage on their own. They got to take their responsibility for themselves, and we should be leaving the government out of this process.
Well, the fact that somebody decides that the current approach isn't working doesn't automatically mean that person's going to see the libertarian answer as the right answer. If you think drugs need to be controlled in some way by the government, just the fact that an outright war on drugs seems to be a failure, that simply means that person will look for other government approaches. And not so there's nothing automatic about settling on the libertarian answer just because the standard war on drugs has failed. In their view, well, there's many other government approaches we can try to see if they work better, and they come up with the public health and harm reduction. I think Thomas Sass used to make a very good point about this. Of course, he was one of the early radical opponents, libertarian opponents of the drug war in any way, shape, or form. And a couple of points he made was that, for one thing, one reason people will be unlikely to, right now, to endorse just freedom as far as drugs go, is that there already is so much public health and government intervention, and now we have Obamacare, but before that we had plenty of other things like mandatory treatment at emergency rooms at hospitals. They had to take anybody that came in. So the taxpayers may well feel that they're going to get hit with a big taxpayer bill if people are free to use drugs because they'll hurt themselves, overdose, take impure drugs and whatnot. So that's one thing holding them back, perhaps, from seeing the sense in the kind of thing we're talking about. And then Saz used to point out that the tort law could also be a problem, namely that there's a very expansive view of tort law that if one person sells another person drugs and the other person, the buyer, then dies or hurts himself, the family or that person may sue the seller on the grounds that, you didn't warn me or, you shouldn't have sold me the drugs or whatever. And there have been such suits in the past. Now, we don't see this in the marijuana states, where the free marijuana states in Washington and Colorado. People do seem willing to sell, even though they're perhaps open to suit if somebody should harm themselves, although maybe the feeling is with marijuana, people don't really harm themselves. And but his point was if you legalized all drugs, he really doubted whether people would be selling them anyway for fear that they'd get sued if anybody ever hurt themselves. So these are all considerations we have to keep in mind when we're trying to persuade people that we have the right answer to this.
Yeah, but my feeling is that let the free market reign. I mean, that's what we do with other products, and people can make their own choices. They can make their choices as buyers, where they want to buy. Do they want to take the risk with a seller that doesn't have any kind of insurance to protect himself in these kind of cases, or doesn't have the money to satisfy a judgment, versus a pharmacy that has deep pockets that's selling the marijuana or the cocaine or whatever? And let people take responsibility for their own choices. I mean, I have no problems whatsoever with people being free to sue somebody on a defective product that's sold, and let the market and the legal process work in that sense. I'm reminded of that letter that Milton Friedman wrote. Of course, Friedman was another Nobel Prize winner, libertarian economist, and he wrote that famous letter. I think it was back like in 1972, the year that I graduated from college. It was an open letter to Bill Bennett, the drug czar. And if people watching this video haven't read that letter, it's really worth going to, because Friedman makes all the same points that libertarians even are making today, that the drug war is a failure, but it's more than a failure. It's brought so much damage and destruction to society, and that it's time to end this thing. And I recall that Bennett responded. I think Friedman's letter was in the Wall Street Journal, and Bennett responded of, "Oh no, we can win this war. We got to stick with it," and so forth. And here we are, decades later, still living with this monstrosity. And boy, if people had just paid attention to what Friedman said back in '72 and adopted that policy prescription of ending the drug war back then, I think society would be better off, Sheldon, and it'd be a lot more peaceful and harmonious society.
Sure, and of course Friedman was right back then, and I can remember in the 70s writing newspaper column. I was a young newspaper columnist writing about ending prohibition and being accused by prominent people in the community of being a drug user, which I wasn't. They thought only somebody on drugs could write such an article. I mean, that was the attitude. Before we win on this, we're going to have to correct a lot of public misconceptions. People think that sort of drug addiction is something that sort of jumps out of an alley and grabs you or grabs their kids without any, of course, active choice on the part of the person. And as long as you see it that way, you're going to think government ought to do something about it, because you're not thinking in terms of agency, right, of a human being doing something, but rather, this demon sort of leaping at you as you're minding your own business and taking over your life. And as long as people think that, they're never going to give up the idea that the government should be controlling this. And there are other aspects of that too. I mean, as long as they believe that these substances cannot be used responsibly, they again will side with the state against legalization. Yet there's lots of research which people ought to read. I mean, they don't have to go reading technical papers. They can read a great book by the Libertarian columnist Jacob Sullum from some years ago called Saying Yes, where through a series of interviews with people and other research, he pointed out that every drug you can name is being used responsibly by people in the evenings, on the weekends, just the same way they drink a martini. You don't hear about those people because, first of all, it's illegal, so they don't talk about it. And the news is sort of filled only with people who get arrested or have hurt themselves or have killed themselves somehow. And so the only impression you get is it's impossible to use these things responsibly. But just like alcohol can be used responsibly, these other things can be used. And until we correct that impression, they're never going to be for freedom in this area. I'm convinced of it.
Yeah, well, your point about them accusing us of being drug users back in the early days, in the 70s and so forth, when we were battling for these ideas. I remember that I could light up the phone lights on the radio shows I was appearing on just by calling for drug legalization, and people would make those kind of ridiculous accusations. But it really goes to show the progress we've made, because now drug legalization is on the table. And you've got 2 states that have now legalized marijuana, and you've got many that have medical marijuana, and there's much more talk about legalizing, if not all drugs, at least marijuana. And even in D.C., the D.C. City Council is talking about legalizing drugs, and there's now a debate whether Congress is going to overrule that or not. And so you look at the progress we've made. I mean, back in the 70s, it was Milton Friedman that was saying, like, get rid of this. And, of course, nobody was accusing Friedman of being a drug addict. But now you've got, police officers, you've got judges, you've got legislators that are calling for an end to the war on drugs. And it really does show the progress we've made. And I look at this thing, Sheldon, and I say, what arguments do the drug warriors have left? I mean, back then in the 70s, they could say, oh, look ahead. We're going to get rid of drugs in society. We're going to really get rid of your drug sellers and the drug users. And they don't have that now. They can't say, look at what we're going to accomplish here, because we've got decades of experience. You've still got the drug sellers. Instead of pharmacies selling drugs, as they did when drugs were legalized in this country, you've got, cartels, drug gangs, and so forth. In other words, they've shoved it into the black market by making it illegal. So you end up attracting all of these unsavory elements, people that will fight for market share, not through the production of a better product, but by killing their competitors. And so I don't see what arguments the drug warriors have left. If you look at our arguments, I would argue that, your point's well taken, that you got to look at drug use in context. Each person is using drugs for a particular reason. And who are we to judge that person and say, oh, well, no, you're doing something bad here and so forth. I would argue that even the person that's wallowing away in drug addiction, in a drug induced stupor, that's part of what freedom's all about. Freedom isn't the right to engage in responsible actions as long as their conduct is peaceful. It's the right to engage in irresponsible actions. So if a person is ruining his life, the state has no role in interfering with that person's life, his choices. Sometimes it's when a person's at the very bottom of the barrel, in total drug addiction, that's where he finds himself. That's where he starts going into AA, and he gets his life back together again. And I would argue as a libertarian, under what authority does the state or the majority say, we're going to grab that person and we're going to punish him because he's a bad person. We're going to lock him away for 30 years in a penitentiary. I don't see that's anything consistent with liberty or humanity. And so I think that they don't have any arguments left, Sheldon, except job security. The DEA has those agents have mortgages. They got to pay like everybody else. They got money with asset forfeiture where they're stealing money from people on the highways, poor people that don't even have drugs. They just have cash. I think it's all about the enlargement of the government at this point and the protection of jobs for those that are involved in the drug trade, including those that are getting bribes in the judiciary, the law enforcement agency, and so forth. I think this is all now a self-protective mechanism for those involved in the drug war trade.
No, I think that's true. There's a lot of money riding on it. I'm not talking about now the corruption, which you just mentioned, but just the legal money. Even the rehab centers, if they're getting compulsory patients who take that over prison, then they're making money off that, and they have no desire to see it end. And then, of course, there's all the corruption you talk about, the stuff that goes on in foreign countries, and just the bribes, and it's a pretty filthy business. I'd say a couple other things. It's true that people certainly can ruin their lives with drugs. They ruin their life with that most widely used drug, alcohol. For some reason, we don't consider that a drug. We talk about drugs and alcohol. Alcohol is a drug. So these are all drugs. Some are culturally blessed, and some are culturally damned. This was Sassis analysis from the start. So we need to be very honest about that. It's a selectivity of what kind of drugs you're allowed to use. So people can wreck their lives on all kinds of things, and of course the state should not interfere, and no individual should physically interfere. But that doesn't mean that we can't draw conclusions. I mean, we're not relativists. We can certainly point out to ourselves, to others, or even to the person involved that he's wrecking his life. That's just part of freedom, also. The other thing I'd mention is even as it becomes, and I'm sort of repeating what I said, but even it becomes more widely recognized that the current approach, the approach that's been going on for so many decades, is failing, it doesn't mean a turn to the libertarian answer. Like I said, there'll be plenty of other state answers that people are going to propose because they still have these false beliefs about drugs. And there was a book some years ago, speaking of alcohol prohibition, which you mentioned earlier, there was a book some years ago that suggested that the reason prohibition ended in 1933 was not a libertarian insight, but the need for revenue. It was the Depression, government, obviously a fall in production, a lot of people unemployed, a lot of less money flowing into the treasury, but people were drinking. And it dawned on the politicians that one way they could restore the coffers, the government's coffers, was to bring alcohol out in the open and tax it. You very often hear about how legalization of marijuana is the key to one of the, at least the state's fiscal problems. Let them start, and the federal too. The federal government too ought to start legalize marijuana and tax it. So I wouldn't get too excited about this being a libertarian triumph. I mean, I'm glad there's progress in recognizing the failure of this war on drugs or people, as Tom always said. But they haven't hit on the libertarian insight yet, unfortunately.
Well, it's like any other part of freedom, is that there's usually a small number of people that are attracted to the moral argument for freedom, that people simply have a right to live their lives any way they choose, so long as their conduct is peaceful. And then there's probably a whole much bigger group of people that respond to the utilitarian arguments of what a disaster this war has been, the collateral damage, the robberies, the muggings, the gang wars, the assassinations, the kidnappings, the violence, the deaths in Mexico, and so forth, the corruption. And so they would say, no, it's time to end it on that basis. And so it doesn't really matter to me what reasons are, as long as people are willing to get rid of this thing. Now, we would never accept the idea as libertarians that the reason for legalizing drugs is the state can tax it and legalize it. But I guarantee you, it would be a significantly better place in America if drugs were legalized and they were subject to taxation, sales tax or whatever, like everything else in society is. You and I would be still fighting to end that taxation. But there's no doubt that all the collateral damage of illegality, criminality would certainly fall by the wayside. And so I think it's important to at least, get a little bit optimistic and encouraging that you got all these prominent people that are saying this thing has been a failure, because at least when people start recognizing that, then they start developing their thought processes. Okay, what do we do now? Hey, let me, in the time we have left, though, I wanted to also talk with you about this new book that's out that I read about in the Washington Post about World War II. It's kind of interesting. It's a book by a man named David Kaiser, and the title of it is How FDR Led the Nation into War. And it's this great big praising book, this paean to Roosevelt about how wise he was to see that America needed to get into World War II, and he saw that the American people wanted no involvement in another European war after the disaster that World War I had been. And so he's written this highly praising book of Roosevelt, leading America into war. And I'm looking at this, Sheldon, and I'm thinking, for one thing, this exposes Roosevelt as a liar. And I haven't read the book, but it seems to me it exposes Roosevelt as the big liar that he was, because throughout the 40 campaign, he was going telling people that it was the exact opposite, that he would do whatever was necessary to keep American boys out of another foreign European war. And now it turns out, according to Kaiser, that he was lying the whole time, that he was actually preparing for American intervention. And it seems to me it's not a big leap from there that if he really believed that it was necessary for the saving of Western civilization for America to get in the war, to go not only from preparation, but to actually trying to provoke Germany and Japan into attacking the United States so that he would finally have his justification for getting into the war. What do you think?
Well, I've not read the book. I only just learned about it over the weekend, and so I don't know what's new in it. That aspect that you just talked about is not new at all. I mean, for a long time, pro-Roosevelt historians denied that he was dishonest and said that, he just lately came to the, realization that the U.S. had to get into the war. But then there was, I don't know when this began, but there was another then wave of pro-Roosevelt historians who pointed out, no, indeed he did. The people didn't want to get into a war, had to be dragged into it, and so that Roosevelt did the right thing in scheming to get in without disclosing this to the American people. I mean, we have the now famous entry in Secretary of War Henry Stimson's diary on the 25th of November 1941, so days before Pearl Harbor, a little more than a week before, where he said, reporting from a cabinet meeting that they had talked about how to maneuver Japan into firing the first shot. So I presume there's something newer in this book than that, because historians have came around on that some time ago and praised Roosevelt for leadership. They claim this was leadership since the people didn't want to get into it. He was right to be scheming and maneuvering to get the U.S. into it, so that the people, because the people didn't really know what their own interests were in that. Of course, once the war started, the people were pretty gung ho about it, which is typical of Americans.
Yeah, well,
once the U.S. was in.
Yeah, it's one of these things where he's saying, I need to disregard what the American people want here. I'm the all-wise person. I know that Nazi Germany is going to end up trying to control the world, and so I need to figure out some way to get America into this war. So, I don't know what Kaiser's saying about this in this book, but clearly this is what he was doing. I mean, he was not only preparing the United States for intervention, that he was doing more than that. He was trying to get America into the war, and it would make sense if he thinks that the freedom of the world is going to be determined on whether the U.S. intervenes or not. I don't think he's going to sit back and say, well, I'll just sit back and wait and see what happens. It was a much more proactive approach. I think that's what the embargo against Japan was all about, the oil embargo. They knew that Japan was in this middle of this war against China. He figured, well, let me put a little stranglehold on them here. And then when there were negotiations taking place with the Japanese, he knew exactly what he was doing about humiliating them, in the hopes that they would turn around and not enter into an agreement with the United States. And, historians have called this the backdoor to war, that he was over there trying to provoke the Germans with Lend-Lease to England, France, and Germany wouldn't take the bait. They wouldn't attack the United States. And so he goes to the Pacific, and so the Pacific is known as FDR's backdoor to war. And then, of course, the other issue is, well, did he know that the attack was coming at Pearl Harbor and turned a blind eye? And that debate is still ongoing, especially since the U.S. won't declassify all the documents and the records relating to the Pearl Harbor attack, including whether the military codes had been broken. I mean, we all know that they tried to keep secret, and they did keep secret, the fact that the U.S. had broken the diplomatic codes. Well, what we still don't know for sure is whether they'd broken the military codes as well. And but whether they specifically knew whether the attack was coming at Pearl Harbor, it seems to me, Sheldon, that the circumstantial evidence is clear that they knew an attack was coming somewhere, especially since they had broken the diplomatic codes. That famous east wind rain message that indicated that Japan was about to break off diplomatic relations, and then all the shenanigans that were going on and trying to get that message to the commanders at Pearl, it all just smells to high heaven, because you get the sense that Roosevelt, with the intent of getting involved into World War II, because he believed it was so important, just looked the other way as the Japanese were attacking at least somewhere.
No, that's true. I've read a lot of that material, and it's quite interesting reading. And new stuff seems to come out all the time. People are constantly writing about this. It's a fascinating question that isn't going to die down for a long time. I still think the bigger question is, getting the issue of whether Roosevelt should have pushed to be involved in the war, out ahead of the American people. I think that's what this book gets at, that Roosevelt wanted the people to clamor for the war before he came out publicly for it. One part that's mentioned in the book that I saw from a review is that when members of Congress came to him and said that they were going to pass a declaration, even if he didn't ask for one, I think he was pleased that things were happening apparently without him. In other words, there was growing sentiment, I guess, to get involved in that war. And you can see, you can certainly see why people would be thinking that. You had NAFTA regimes, certainly in Germany and Japan. Japan was doing terrible things in China and other places. And while, they would portray it as a threat to the United States, which was a case, they needed to make, but I don't think they were able to make it. I think Roosevelt correctly read the tea leaves that there would be increasing clamoring to get involved in the war, and that he could help that along and ride it without publicly not being the one leading it. So he was a pretty brilliant politician in that regard. I guess it's pretty universally agreed to that he was a pretty smart politician. And from his point of view, he obviously played it correctly. The U.S. got in the war.
Yeah, he did. I mean, he succeeded in accomplishing what he wanted. But look, did World War II succeed in making America a freer, a better place? I mean, the interventionists often say, we couldn't have survived a world with Hitler in charge. Well, Hitler was the guy that couldn't even muster the military forces to cross the English Channel. How was he going to cross the Atlantic? And if you can survive a world with Joseph Stalin and the communists, and we obviously did, why would a world with Hitler in it be any different? And in fact, if you look at the consequences of World War II, where the communists now control all of Eastern Europe instead of Hitler, because remember, that was the reason that England declared war on Germany in the first place, to free Poland from Hitler's tyranny, you end up under communist tyranny. And so, that's why the Eastern Europeans certainly didn't see the end of World War II as a big victory. They, along with the East Germans, ended up under the tyranny of communism, which was America's World War II partner and ally. That launches the whole Cold War. America ends up with a national security state apparatus, CIA, Pentagon, that ultimately morphs into the whole war on terrorism. We got Vietnam, we got the Korean War, where 100,000 Americans died, and you've got, of course, all the interventions that have taken place, the move toward empire. I mean, Sheldon, if this is victory, heaven forbid that we should have suffered a loss. Anyway, I guess we ought to wrap it up since our time's up. And greatly enjoyed the conversation again. Hope you enjoyed this issue of the Libertarian Angle, and we look forward to talking to you next time.